Welcome, everyone, to In the Hot Seat. For our repeat viewers, thanks for coming back again. For those new to the show, every 2 weeks we put industry experts and our customers in the hot seat for a lively discussion, debate, maybe even a little discourse as we humanize the digital experience. All aspects of the customer life cycle are up for discussion, as well as the technologies used throughout each phase of the journey. In this episode, which is a continuation of our application modernization series, we're going to discuss application modernization in higher ed. So exciting topic, right, Steve?
Absolutely. They, one of the things that intrigues me in terms of how this is going to go is that question of centralization and decentralization.
Yep.
I have colleagues at the University of West Florida, some of whom don't want to do what IT wants them to do because they know better and they're very sophisticated with their use of technology. We have others who don't want to go along because they don't know anything about it and don't want to. So
yeah,
and everything in between.
It's interesting because I read, I shared that article with you. I'd read that article in EdTech magazine, it sort of reminds me of an argument we had in the enterprise space several years ago, I guess is a better way to put that. And it's really this sort of tug of war between, do you need a centralized approach so that you have control, or do you go decentralized so that you get close to the customer and the end user and you have a better experience? And I think, in business, we kind of ended up in a world where the IT role shifted a bit and the line of business shifted into the decision maker. And the IT world, it's more of the governance, compliance, security, making sure that anything that's brought in meets all of the right standards and, is integrated and et cetera. So maybe that's the world that we're going to look to in higher ed, that it needs to be a combination of both, right? Because you need the student perspective, you need the professors, the department heads, the users of the tools. And then the other thing, Stephen, I thought this was interesting too when I was reading this article. It talks about, because I guess in business we don't really think about it this way, but the business side versus the student or the learning side, and there seems to be a bit of a divide between which gets the attention and which gets the budget.
There are some things like the online education platforms. People seem to accept that those should be centralized, i.e., we use Canvas. We were Blackboard before, and that seems to be acceptable. But it's much harder to get people to centralize things like, okay, this is the statistics package I like, and the IT people are going, hey, cybersecurity, we're not going to accept statistical packages that were created in Eastern Europe, for example.
Right.
We don't want you downloading those to our computer, and consequently. And so the cybersecurity issue comes in there. Again, some people accept that and some don't.
Yeah. There is a bit of, and you just sort of triggered something that I hadn't really thought about, but there is a bit of that. I'm the professor, I'm teaching this class, and I know the tools that are going to be the most effective for, the educational process, like, I'm teaching design and I want to use AutoCAD, or I want to use, Inventor, or I want to use, whatever. I guess there is a certain amount of a bit different than it is in business, because I may like using this particular package, but there are a dozen others that would do the same thing, right? But it's not necessarily true when you're trying to teach.
Well, I'm an example of that. I would like to use JASP, which I think it comes out of Denmark. Well, if my students are going to use that in a lab on campus, that's not going to happen because we're not going to get permission from IT to use it. The advantage of it is it's a statistics package. It's really easy to use and it's free. It's an open source package,
right?
And they just don't want to let that in. And I understand the cybersecurity reasons behind it.
Well, open source is there's always arguments around it, but the truth is it's the most transparent of the ways to develop. So I don't know. I guess I do get that there are certain things that are going to trip their security versus others, and Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good question to pose to our guest. You want to do a quick intro?
Well, absolutely. We have with us, and I want to make sure I get all of this right. Mike Dillon, who is the CEO of ElastiForce. It's a global technology services and product company. He's got a lot of experience in working with higher education for PwC and others, everything from ERP development to other things related to what our real topic today is, which is technological advancement in higher ed. So I'm looking forward to welcoming Mike.
Mike, welcome.
Thank you, Michael and Steve, and happy Indigenous People Day, by the way.
Oh yeah, and thank you for saying it that way. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
We're all learning, right?
Hey, that's absolutely correct. Well, so Mike, we might as well just jump in. One of the things that I really trying to understand when I was thinking about this topic, because I mean, obviously I've been exposed to modernization in the business world, but it seems like there's some different issues here. So what are the key challenges in higher ed, when you're modernizing both applications and infrastructure?
I think this goes back to your dialogue that you two were just having. When we talk about higher ed and the difference with business is really the decentralization, right? The pockets of autonomy and sort of the joint authority with faculty in terms of managing it. So I think, you've got a federation of departments and schools that don't want to be centrally managed, yet in a way in this area, and I kind of, I think your hybrid approach is about right, that you need to figure out what's important to centralize and standardize on, and where you have opportunities to be more nimble and agile in the departments. But largely, a lot of these things that need to be addressed are similar with business. So you have legacy systems that don't integrate well. You've got concerns when you're modernizing about data migration. Cybersecurity, which you two mentioned, is such a high concern. Yeah. And when I talk about, I'll throw out a reference. I'm not going to name the institution, but there was a very large, prestigious public university that tried to centralize data center. They realized that they had risk out in the department, so they wanted to offer the carrot. So they said, well, we'll host all your systems centrally in a data center that we can keep secure. And they weren't forcing people to do it. There was an economic benefit to the departments for doing this. And in this multi-year journey, they had a department, one of the larger ones, had a data breach, and hundreds of thousands historical student records were broken into, including social security numbers. So this is a real challenge. But if we go along with the besides cybersecurity, there's the cost, there's downtime, there's the skills gap, both the skills gap in understanding the legacy applications that need to be modernized, and the skills gap in actually getting them modernized. So going to a third party or somebody that specializes in it is important. There's a resistance to change, even though change is something that could be should be looked at positively. So, I think those are some of the things, and then the whole approach. What's the right approach for this particular app in terms of the modernization effort? So,
is there some difference in the way that budgets are allocated here too? Like I said, you got the business side and you got the education side. Like, does money flow one direction or the other more often, or are there more legacy apps maybe in the business side? I don't know. I'm just assuming, but
yeah. That's an interesting one, right? If you're undertaking a large modernization effort, then that's a CapEx versus OpEx spend. Your ongoing efforts are all OpEx. And I think when you're looking at budget, and maybe the one interesting thing with budgets and in terms of where we are with app modernization today, is that there are really good tools and not smoke and mirror tools, really good tools that can take say legacy database and upgrade it to a modern database that's got all the security in it. And that can be done programmatically, automated. The part that can't really be done, and anybody that says that they can do this is not being totally truthful, and that's the updating of the code, right? And this is really a great opportunity, not just to update the code, but that is generally, if you can continue with that same code line, but this is also an opportunity to standardize that as well. But if your budget doesn't allow it, let's just get it into a modern database. Let's get it cloud enabled, right? That's the first step and an important step.
Well, one of the things that I've seen, first of all, in some consultancy in businesses, I ran into the same thing, and that is the conflict. One large firm I worked with at one point had eight different systems that would not talk to each other. Now this is going back a number of years, and if you wanted to transfer data from one to the other, it involved a lot of typing.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's not an old school answer, because
No.
Unfortunately I still see this problem all the time. The only difference now, Steve, is that when I ask how many applications they have, it's not 8, it's more like 30.
It's not 8, it's like 8, like 30. Well, I mean, what we have to deal with, of course, are students coming from a variety of backgrounds, and then we have like a few systems that I mentioned earlier, like Canvas, for example, is our teaching platform for online classes. Before it was Blackboard, and if you had everything else set up on Blackboard, you were reluctant to change over to Canvas. But I mean, people got over that to some degree, most. And then I have a colleague who did not. But what are the things that you're saying that are most effectively centralized, and what things could we kind of let be a little more relaxed on?
Yeah, I guess it depends on the security of the data. I mean, there's certainly some things, right? So enterprise-wide learning management system, really key, right? It makes it a lot easier to have standards at that point, right? Instead of everybody doing it. And it's also easier from, cybersecurity. It's easier from a contract negotiation standpoint with the vendors, anyway. So that's certainly one. I think there's probably some student things that don't necessarily touch the student system, which obviously should be standardized as well, and most institutions is. But there might be some self-service, some things that make maybe guidance a little easier. Academic advising should be standardized as well, right? That's a huge, wonderful area for AI, by the way. If AI can go in and look at your student system, and students can ask questions like, if I shift majors, is it extending my time to degree? I mean, this is something where AI can rapidly go into the system and look like, if you're a chemistry student, you move to biology and you've done your general ed, this is what it would look like, your curriculum planning for the next couple of years, and you get out on time, right? They can do all that stuff.
That's interesting. I mean, that would be a great use of what's already kind of happening in the business world around chatbots and customer service. It's the same sort of issue, right? And especially dealing with all that data information that you need to parse through. It's just very difficult for a human to do that, but the machine can certainly do that much faster.
Obviously, you need the expertise on the side of prompt engineering to come up, because those curricula and those curricular changes are moving. They're constantly moving, because I'm on a bunch of these committees that are approving these things and moving them forward, because we're trying to keep up.
Yeah, I mean, the good news is that the systems that are being developed now have moved prompt engineering back a layer, so you don't really have to deal with that as a user so much. I mean, you obviously have to be able to answer a question, but
Yeah.
The other thing, have you encountered this kind of budgetary situation? Like, we have technology fees built into our tuition, And that periodically updates the computers in the classrooms and the projectors and that sort of thing. But that updating doesn't take that updating of the infrastructure doesn't take place very often. How often should it take place?
Yeah. Well, it's completely different as we move into the cloud, right? You don't have to worry about that infrastructure as you move to the cloud, and I think that's one of the key shifts that has taken place. Is the building out infrastructure is a whole different animal today than it was even 10 years ago. So, that continuation of moving to the cloud, and what I'm really excited about is the new generation of student systems that are in the cloud, right? And Oracle's in early stages of their beta release, but Workday's out there, and you've got a variety of other Illusion and Anthology, and basically we're looking at a major shift. You haven't seen a shift like this since the late 90s. So anyway, but I would say the infrastructure is it's a whole different thing. Let's move the big cost and CapEx spend to OpEx, and like which you've mentioned already, you have a student fee that helps support technology. Well, it's the same kind of thing now. You can be able to move everything to OpEx.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so just to come back, we talked a little bit about legacy, and now we're talking about cloud, and I sort of want to see how this fits in a framework as I think about this. We talk a lot about digital transformation, or frankly, I like to call it digital first. And is that something that is being embraced in education as well? And if so, how does that kind of tie into this idea of moving those legacy systems forward, and how does that play into a digital transformation sort of initiative?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's studies on this, and COVID in particular for higher ed really push the gas pedal down on digital transformation, right? And obviously we've talked about LMS. Certainly it started there, but most CEOs, I think they say something around 84% of CIOs are now, or within the next 3 years, they're going to engage in a digital transformation, and so that's happening across the market. And digital transformation now is a higher concern for most, or a higher priority. I shouldn't say concern. And then cybersecurity and even cloud implementations. The digital transformation, analyzing what's out across the enterprise and where they're going to get the biggest bang for the buck, right? In terms of prioritizing and hitting the most amount of stakeholders.
Well, a number of universities have been hit with ransomware. Really certainly across the U.S. I'm not familiar with what's going on, but with others. Does the cloud security improve that versus does that improve that security? Because obviously the idea of isolating your computer by air is one way to do it, but then you can't do things like online teaching.
Right.
And part of that, it does come into the attitude of the CIO, but also the attitude of the other IT people working around campus.
Yeah, I would say that it's interesting when the move to the cloud was in its early days. I think people were highly worried about it being more risky, right? And in fact, it's less risky. It's much less risky now. And you have these major corporations that have invested, whether it's AWS or Microsoft, in the infrastructure security. And so you really you have less risk moving to the cloud than you do with your on-prem systems.
That would have been my guess. One of the issues that budgetarily you see is people can go, okay, we just spent your tech fee and there's the computer.
Yeah.
And now we're going to spend your tech fee and here's something that's changed in the cloud, but you can't really kick that.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Well, is the legacy system problem enough of a drag on this transition that it really is something that they have to focus on? Like, does it get in the way of your ability to implement new stuff, or are there strategies around that for the department?
No, I mean, basically interoperability or integration with other systems is a key lagging. You've got limitations on being able to advance a legacy system because old code, knowledge of that system, it could have been, it's spaghetti coded often. So
Right.
people are afraid to touch the core of the system, even though the core could be just at this point outdated. So they build onto it instead of really trying to upgrade it. And and then, you're not able to really address as quickly customer experience, right? Or the needs of the business. So yeah, it's a big drag. And, it's funny. The amount of growth in application modernization over the forecasted growth over the next few years. So they're talking about a CAGR of 16.8% between 2024 and 2030. And that application modernization market is going to grow from, it's about 15 billion right now. It's projected to grow to over 52 billion by 2030. So you can see there's a lot of old legacy applications that are sitting out there, right? And I've got an interesting one. It's not higher ed, but we're working with a company right now that's a healthcare software company in the UK, and they've grown through acquisitions and mergers, and they have over 100 legacy applications that they need to undertake and modernize. So
that doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, I talked to a company not long ago that had 32 different versions of SAP. So, I mean, just one ERP system, and it was in 32 different pieces. So.
An old Air Force buddy of mine is both a software engineer and a medical doctor, and he decided to just retire from medicine because he didn't want to have to update the system again. But right now, what my customers, if you will, they're both customer and product, and that's my students are dealing with things like, okay, I've got Canvas, but I also use PackBack. And it integrates to some degree, but not at all perfectly. So I got all these inquiries about, well, my grading PackBack hasn't updated. Well, what it does is double the number of grading columns, and one of them is empty and the other one's not. It's just simple, stupid stuff like that ends up with a lot of emails.
Yeah.
I mean, are there a list of some best practices that you'd use when we're talking about these kinds of issues? I mean, not just legacy, but the overall modernization and transformation process for an educational institution.
Yeah. And some of these are common with any kind of implementation, right? One, if you're going to undertake it, and again, this is going to be partly contingent on budget. We mentioned you could modernize say a database and get cloud enabled and have all the cyber security concerns addressed without doing a full modernization. But ideally, don't look at it as a replacement project. Look at it, how do I advance the business, right? Start there, build out the requirements, act like you have somewhat of a blank slate, and prioritize, what's the minimum viable product of the new product, addressing new requirements, and then what are the nice to haves, and then you can build out your budget based on that. Gaining the stakeholder input to help define that, like widen the audience so that you're making sure that you're going to be on target with the final product. And then set your clear objectives and your measures of success. And then probably most importantly, because, if you've got a legacy application, it's probably, been around for a long, long time. And you need to prepare for the change. So provide a robust end user training program and a way to sustain it, because now you're going to have a program that's going to be extensible. You're going to be able to constantly change it. So you need to figure out, what's my plan for constant, user training, updates, new hires, training, that kind of thing.
Related to that, one of the audiences that we face, of course, is going to be things like in Florida, it's the Board of Governors. It's institution-wide. It's not just the University of West Florida. It's also Florida State, the University of Florida, and so on. I mean, there's a bunch of them. And two groups we have to convince in a lot of these instances are like the Board of Governors and the state legislatures. Now, how do we do that?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess there's a difference in public versus private. I didn't really think about it in that context either, but from a budget constraint perspective, certainly the process is different.
Yes.
Between the two types of institutions.
MIT can decide to do something, or Northwestern, where I went, they can go, hey, we're going to do this. We might want to do this. The University of Florida might want to do something else. The Board of Governors is going to pick.
Yeah.
I mean, that really brings up the kind of this back and forth between balance in, modernization with budget and also resource, I would assume is an issue for some institutions anyway. So, I mean, how can educational institutions walk around that problem, right? Balancing budget with the constraints.
I mean, I don't think there's an easy path there, but it's going to go back to prioritizing. And I think when you're dealing with, obviously, as you know, right, when you're dealing with state legislatures and they're so distant from what's going on in the market, what are reasonable costs? You really need to benchmark what are the typical costs for this. The other thing is and I hate to say it, but you move the needle more with decision makers based on risk rather than benefit. So, do the risk analysis. What's it costing us to not move? And what's the potential, especially if there's a cyber risk, what's the potential liability sitting out there if we don't do this?
Right. And that gets into things like that perception of, is it riskier in the cloud than it is on the ground in the traditional hardware. And I think that's a perception we would have to really work on changing with those groups.
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, it sounds like, I mean, that's something that we got on surveys and dealt with a lot in 2006, 7, 8, right? But then cloud in the business world really sort of tipped over to mainstream in 2008, mostly because of the recession at first, but certainly eventually because they realized, Mike, what you said, that the data centers have much higher standards, much higher certifications, they're much more likely to be secure than those one-off data centers that you do that aren't run by an organization whose reputation depends on that data center, right?
Well, the other issue with the data transformation I'm a faculty member, so this concerns me, and that's some are have to look at it and go, well, okay, with a digital transformation, you can have 100 students in a section, as opposed to 25 for an MBA class, for example. And that means we can use our faculty more efficiently. And that kind of thing has already been taking place at some of the larger institutions where principles of economics is being taught to 800 students, where some of them are actually physically in the classroom and others are just watching on a Zoom call. How do we, again, using that risk analysis, how do we create that balance in terms of, again, the thinking of administrators and others higher up the food chain?
Yeah, and I guess we're at a really interesting junction point here with how far we do this, but AI can help immensely with the workload. And Georgia Tech, and this is years ago, right? They had a class where they had an AI teaching assistant, and none of the students knew that it was an AI teaching assistant. It answered their questions. When and if it got into a question that couldn't be answered, it would defer it to the professor. But, and I know that the initial thought is, oh no, we need to have people talking to people. But if you think about AI being able to personalize education now, right, and really understand, I can give you an assessment, for instance, and ask a question one way, and in the past, that was the only time I would ask this question to find out whether you knew this particular part of the subject. Now I can ask it this way and realize maybe the instrument is biased. I may ask AI, may then say, okay, well, they got it wrong this way. Let me ask the same type of question, assessment question, in a different way and see if I get the right response. But if you think about that level of personalization, right? Or I find gaps in your learning, right? And ASU is doing this. ASU has a digital AI that will look, and it assesses where students are at, and it tries to fill the gaps. It tries to figure out, hey, how can I help move the student along? So
I mean, that must have a huge impact on student experience, right? I mean, and you kind of went down that road a little earlier when we were talking about the chatbot and how that could help from a student perspective. But I mean, how does that all tie in with this modernization effort, the focus around student experience and engagement? Is that?
Yeah. Again, I'll say that one, we mentioned a couple of use cases, right? The academic advising one, key, right? Where you can go through and look through massive amounts of data and get responses back very quickly. That's going to be true about every part of the student service arenas. Really key, though, the learning side of it, man. That's where we're going to see transformation. And instead of being afraid of Gen AI, right? We need to look at Gen AI as something that's going to start being a foundation that will extend the human capability, not detract from it, not take it away, not weaken it. But if we're using Gen AI as a foundation that then actually can push you forward, you can accomplish much more. So
there are some key concepts in our. I teach in business, principally marketing and supply chain. There are some key concepts throughout business that if student doesn't understand them at the very beginning, then they're going to really have a hard time moving along. And that's things like debits and credits in accounting, or time value of money, for example. One of my colleagues has actually gamified that. She used AI to create a game to teach people credits and debits, and then also time value of money. And apparently it works like a charm. But she could not do that programming herself. She had AI create it and then was able to do it.
Yeah.
She's one of our accounting professors she's really gotten into this stuff. The textbook companies have already been doing this for a while with some of their online quizzes and so on. Just keep doing this till you get it right, which for me personally fits wonderfully. I don't want students to do something once and get a grade. I want them to keep doing it until they get it.
Yeah,
exactly. Do it over until you understand it.
Right.
And it seems to me like AI is the way to go there.
Yeah. No, I love that. I love that. It's like we're not stopping here and just letting you, be mediocre. We're going to push you. You can be as good as you possibly can be. I want you to master the subject, right? Let's continue to provide the aids that will help you get there.
That really does change the student experience in that whole idea. And we talk about customer in the business world, we talk about personalization, but I mean in this situation, you're really talking about personalized learning so that you could optimize the way the student interacts with the information to be able to retain it. That's exciting.
Yeah.
What you've talked about seems to make it possible, let's say for me, to deal with 150 students instead of 75 in effective ways by saying, okay, you need to go over and do this and repeat this until you get it right, because this thing will tutor you. I mean, there is an AI tutor me. Came out of Khan Academy, and it does that. And particularly that seems to work well for quantitative. Now, how does the poet deal with this? I'm teaching a poet. I'm teaching beginning students in English poetry, and some of them start turning in AI stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is different.
Yeah, I mean, that's a real challenge, right? Because you want them to master enough that they can do it on their own. And yeah, I think those are, I mean, those are some of the, still to be defined areas. Yeah, and not sure I have an answer for that one, but it'll be interesting to figure out. Okay, does poetry actually evolve in a different way that it gets better? But it's getting better because you're using both AI and then the human element to it. But
I mean, there's definitely in the creative side of the world, there are a lot of questions around AI and how it plays together.
Yeah.
So go back to modernization a little bit. I'm just curious about, because we talked a little bit about SaaS and cloud and that sort of thing, but I mean, now in business, we're actually starting to see some movement to more of a hybrid. And is that something that you see in higher ed, or is it still really more of the opportunity to use cloud has such a big impact on the institution and the ability to move forward quickly, that's really the focus right now is cloud and SaaS?
Yeah, I would say that that's more the case than hybrid. I mean, there is a big push. Part of it, in particular higher ed, and I know that there's certain other cases, let's say open enrollment, since we're getting near November, and that's open enrollment period, where you've got peak processing time, right? And so, if you're on-prem, you're investing in all that peak processing for that particular event. Where cloud, you don't have to have that investment. You can have the elasticity when you need it. So it's a big cost savings. So I think, in general in higher ed, back to the question is it's still a move to the cloud. And, depending on the type of institution, right, you got the prestigious ones that are moving more rapidly there, and you've got smaller, if they're economically can't afford, let's say to invest in a new cloud-based student system, they're lagging a bit. But I think overall cost will come down for any cloud application, so the new student systems will probably be, maybe a couple fold more expensive than they will be in 10 years. So,
well, it's interesting too, because there's a lot of shifting. We talking about AI here, but there's a lot of shift from a pricing perspective around AI. And I just wonder what kind of impact that's going to have on institutions, because certainly it's much more difficult in a, pay for use kind of model to budget, because it's not as predictable. Maybe is that something that you've had seen come up? I mean,
no, but I mean, I think it's like every technology. The longer it's around, the cheaper it's going to get. So,
in this modernization process, do you see, let's say, certifications starting to overcome degrees, for example?
Yeah. No, I mean, as you know, right, when you're in this industry, it's never been more under attack for what value it provides. And the shame I'll say in part of this is that everybody equates the value for, hey, what's your economic opportunity afterwards, right? There's an intrinsic part of learning that's important. It makes you better, more well-rounded, more understanding of different cultures and history, et cetera, that I think is invaluable. But yet, I guess there's all kinds of different ways you can slice and dice the value of education. You can go back and say, hey, there was a point in time, a little over 100 years ago, maybe 5% of the population went to college. Now we've got masses, after the GI Bill, right? The extension of education, which for the most part is good. But if we always evaluate education based on what job I get, right? If it's the consumerization of higher ed, then certificates are going to be done, and certificates are fine for maybe 50% of the traditional student population. Maybe that's what they need, if they're looking just for a job. But I think we lose something in the process if job is the only, and their economic benefits the only way that we judge higher education.
Do we have, like, Mike, do you have some examples that you could share about successful digital transformation? I'd love to get some sort of context to that, and how what lessons that came out of that
Yeah. I'll point out my alma mater, UCLA, right? They've undertaken a lot of, they've got a big master plan around digitization, right? And they've done a wonderful job with learning management. We talked about learning management. There was obviously a big press on that. They've done the development of a lot of cloud-based services, cybersecurity measures. They've digitized their library system. So those are the successes. I'll point out one. They wanted to modernize their financial system and put in a new cloud-based financial system. Huge undertaking. Change in some leadership along the way, and they abandoned the project after spending a lot of money. And I think the lesson learned there is the importance of leadership alignment. At an institution like UCLA, huge, complex, what they wanted to undertake was a lot of standardization so that the reporting and things could be more immediate and could be done in a way where it's standardized, that the type of reporting, and they would have had a wonderful outcome of this, had they continued with it. But the cost ended up becoming probably the biggest barrier. But I think they were on the right track. But anyway, there was a failure, and I guess when you have a change in leadership, then you can't really say that it was a problem with leadership alignment, because they did a really good job initially before the project started, and then in the early stages with that, and they had the majority of people in line with even the cost. But other cases of, we'll stick with the University of California. So University of California, San Diego, they implemented what they called Triton Link, which is an online student portal it provides all the academic resources for a student, including class registration, financial aid, aids to assist them in their learning effort, which is fantastic. And then we mentioned ASU. ASU, again, with that artificial intelligence that they've embedded in their learning analytics, which will track a student's performance and identify where they may need support. And then this is maybe one other thing, and I'll mention this and I'll turn it back to you. But one of the really cool things is what ASU did around a digital prep academy, which is an online school that provides personalized learning experience for students. And people can just take, students can just take one class if they want, or they can be fully enrolled in it because it's accredited. And I just was watching the Sunday Morning, the show with Jane Pauley, and they did a profile on a 9-year-old chess prodigy, and it just happened to be, because I know about ASU. I didn't realize the prodigy, who's traveling all over the world, and he's actually he's the youngest ever to defeat a grandmaster. He is enrolled in ASU's Digital Prep Academy. So here you got something that's really enabling students, and just fascinating.
Well, how much of that is due in part to the massive online enrollment that ASU has?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, it's feeding it, right? And you can imagine I'll say the surplus rather than profitability, the surplus that generates and enables for continued investment in AI, curriculum, et cetera.
I mean, how do you see this going forward? And maybe take out your crystal ball. What do you think is going to, what's the future of digital transformation in higher ed over the next, I don't know, say 5 years? And I know that's hard because AI changes daily, but nonetheless.
Well, I mean, I think I'll use the term tectonic, and actually that's kind of a funny word to use, tectonic for tech. But we're in the middle of that tectonic change, with AI, digital transformation, cloud-based student systems, which we mentioned. I mean, I think you're going to see radical transformation in the next 5 to 10 years, including, what's going to continue to be this consumerization of higher education. Is it all about, hey, just give me the information I need to get X, Y, Z job. So, there was the ability to push education out with online learning is fascinating in itself. But you couple that with better assessments, and as we discussed, tools that will be able to help fill the gaps for where students are lagging and learning in a particular area. So all kinds of amazing things. I got one, I don't know if you know the Khan Academy.
Yeah.
They provide free online courses, and I love this story. And this is pre-AI, but there was a lady, and you might know the story. There was a lady. She was about 12 years old when the Taliban took back over Afghanistan, and she was no longer allowed to go to school. So, but she had older brothers that were going, and they were progressing. But she happened to have internet connection. She happened to have a tablet, and she started taking Khan Academy classes. And she started with basic teaching herself English, right? So she could take the classes. Started there, and then she was math and science and history, and she moved on to algebra and trigonometry and physics. And anyway, she decided she really wanted to become a theoretical physicist, and and it was all enabled by this online learning, right? And then she basically smuggled herself into Pakistan to be able to take an SAT exam, did really well, and she went to ASU and graduated with honors, and now she's a member of the research faculty at Tufts University. And you think about, wow, the massive human impact that online, digital, now it's going to be assessments and improvements in learning, what that's going to enable. And the Khan Academy, for instance, is really putting a lot of focus now on that personalization of education. So it's a cool time. It's a wonderful time.
We hope to hear a lot more stories like that one, to be truthful, but that's pretty much our time for the day, Mike. And you have survived the hot seat, if you will. And of course, anyone who thinks that they have the ability to come in here and survive the hot seat, we welcome them. That is the end of the hot seat episode for today. And we sure appreciate those who attended online and look forward to having people visit the recording. Again, thank you, Mike.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure.